Okay, welcome back for episode 2 of 3-Day Weeks. I'm Lloyd, and this is Kurt. Kurt, I've basically been exploding Kurt's brain for about 2 hours so far. We're cutting this up into episodes to make them a little more digestible. And I realized in my previous episode, I really tried to give Kurt the history of work from the agricultural revolution, even before the agricultural revolution, up to almost the present day. But I'm doing that on purpose because actually, as we talked about in the first episode, most of history happened before agriculture. So when we talk about the importance of history in a discussion, let's say that humans evolved starting 50,000 years ago. Most of our history happened between then and 10,000 years ago. That's 80% of our history. The last 10,000 years is only 20% of our history. So actually talking about that 80% is actually a little bit more important than talking about that last 20. And the reason I'm making that case so hard for you is that I'm trying to point out that the way things are right now is very, very recent. It's very, very specific to our circumstances today. And that most of human history is entirely different, entirely different way of living. Most human development happened before farming. And most development after farming only accounts for a small part of what we are as a species. So this idea when people tell you things like, and Americans especially get into this thing of like capitalism is the way humanity works, right? This is complete and utter nonsense. This is like saying, breathing is how humanity works. I mean, it's true, but it's not. Capitalism is a flash in the pan. Capitalism is 200, 300, okay, you can even say 700 years of history. And it has brought some of the greatest technological developments, some of the greatest human development, some of the greatest development of knowledge. But it is very, very recent. And the idea that you can't change it, or you can't shape it, or you can't get past it, or that it is solely responsible for human progress is really ridiculous. When you look at all the context of human history, you realize that capitalism is just last week. If your life is a timeline of history, capitalism was Saturday. You know what I mean? And the rest of it was the rest of it. It's like when you're in your 30s, right? Most of your life, still the majority of your life, you were a child.
I mean, you could technically say even now.
In some ways.
In some ways.
So I think that's really important for understanding the context of what we're talking about, which is a 3-day week. Right? It's the idea of reforming our society to recenter, we talked about this before, to recenter our lives around something else than a job. That taking 3 days of work out of a week, and why a week instead of a 10-day? No reason, just because we're familiar with weeks. Taking 3 out of 7 and working those 3 and having 4 free. And what does that mean? Not only it's not 4-day weekends, it's 4-day weeks and 3-day work weeks. Which is very different. And we're going to get to in later episodes why it's very different. But I quickly, let's say in one episode, I want to kind of talk about how we go from industrialism to the current model of thinking about value. We talked about how for the longest time, essentially for virtually all of human history, the thing that had value was knowledge. The idea of you learn how to control your environment, and that is valuable. Then for a relatively small part of our history, we learn that, or we begin to think that actually land is valuable.
Yeah.
Right? And for 10,000 years, land is kind of the most valuable thing. And now, for let's say the last 1,000 years or less, we have come to think that work is the most valuable thing. So we can see that slowly we're getting into these smaller periods of actually understanding from the Enlightenment to today is really, a tiny leap.
Yeah.
And it's a time in which we've come to understand labor and time as being something of value. And that brings us to the Industrial Revolution. So, did you study the Industrial Revolution in school?
Brief.
What-
I was a little shit in school, so
What pops into your head when I say Industrial Revolution?
factories.
What kind of factories?
War. Things to do with the war. It was mainly
Industrial.
making
Heavy
things
metal.
from metals,
Yeah.
tanks, all that sort of shit.
So would it interest you to know this? It interested me because I had those same visions. The steam engine, for example.
Yes.
Would it interest you to know that the steam engine was invented by the ancient Greeks?
I mean, it is interesting to know. Yes. Thank you for.
So the steam engine was invented by the ancient Greeks, and they even hooked up wheels to it and made little mobiles.
It doesn't surprise me, if I'm
Right.
honest. But yes.
So they even had the concept of making a steam engine, putting it on wheels, and letting it move. So they basically had cars.
Yeah.
But they treated it as a toy. Wow. Interestingly enough, they treated it as a toy. So why did they treat something like this as a toy? And this gets to the question of really, when did we start looking at labor as not human work now, but mechanical work? When did that happen? So I'll give you the answers because you're giving me the perplexed look.
Yeah, I don't know.
during the colonial period, one of the things that colonizers quickly found was that there were certain crops which were of very high value, which could be imported and sold for cash, so-called cash crops. Right? There was a handful of them, and basically we can thank the ancient Americas for many of these things because they transformed the world. Suddenly Europeans found out about sugar, which they'd never had before.
Right.
Vanilla, chocolate, tobacco, cotton. Cotton existed. Cotton existed in Egypt. It existed in the ancient world. But it was in the Americas that cotton became a cash crop. It was a place where it could be grown quickly and cheaply. And quickly, European society became addicted to these products. These products had something special about them. What did they have that was special about them? What do you think? That they took work to produce, and the more work you put into producing them, the more you could make. Right? So when you think about cotton, especially after the invention of the cotton gin, that's the mechanical comb that separates seeds from the cotton fibers, that allowed English industry to take in these massive amounts of cotton. Okay, so these cash crops, they create a situation where the more you work, the more you can produce. The more you can produce, the more money you can make. And that gets us to the Industrial Revolution, because if you could build water mills, windmills in areas that had seasonal changes in weather, that produced an energy gradient, which produces basically mechanical work. You can spin a turbine and that will produce energy. And then the more cotton you can separate, the more sort of lathes you can run, the more lines you can run, the more you can produce. And that meant that we needed lots and lots of workers to work on those machines, the spinning jennies and the flying shuttlecocks and all this stuff. And this is when you've heard the expression, Britain is the workshop of the world. That's the period where this starts to be true. And these places like Scotland, Northern England, Wales, places where there was access to running water, where there was high wind, they started to attract industrialists. And industrialists built mills and employed, guess who? Children to work in them. So suddenly you have a society where most of the work now is in factories. And meanwhile, by the way, and this is relevant for us, the Americas also present the opportunity to remove more people from the farms by introducing even better crops than what the Europeans already had. That meant corn, potatoes, things that are easy to grow, that produce a huge amount of calories.
What did they have before?
In Europe?
No, in America.
Well, they had potatoes and.
So they introduced it to Europe. You said?
Yeah. So before contact with Americas, Europe had no tomatoes.
Oh right.
No potatoes. No chocolate. No sugar. No vanilla.
Yeah.
No turkey. No corn.
So agriculture was pretty shocking in Europe then.
Yeah. Well, they had wheat and millet. But think about Italian food without tomatoes.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty rough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
luckily we didn't give a shit about the Italians at that point. So.
But it was definitely different. But one of the things that the introduction of the potato into Europe did was create a huge amount of food.
Yeah. Which
allowed many children to be born. Those children then could be employed.
Yeah.
In jobs which were difficult, dangerous. I think it was the Harding Commission, I could be wrong on the name, in the 1830s produced reports of the conditions in these factories in Britain where children as young as 3 years old were being employed and pressed into service and beaten. Oh, wow. And many of them were working from, in some cases, 5 in the morning until 9, 10 o'clock at night, and being kept in dark and cold circumstances. And one of the reasons they did that was mills are seasonal. A mill only runs when the water is running. Yeah. A water mill. So you can, if you've got a cotton factory hooked up to a mill, you want to run that cotton factory as much as you can for as long as you can. Yeah. And the best people to do many of those little manual jobs in the factory were kids. Tiny little kids. So that was a time in which the concept of wage labor had proliferated. And now parents, sort of following the, let's say, the natural evolution of the market, natural thinking of laissez-faire economics. You know the term laissez-faire economics?
Let's just say I don't.
Well, it's the idea of capitalism with no restriction, right? This was what was being practiced in Britain at that time. Right. They had what they thought was this incredible riches from colonialism, from trade. So they said, we don't need any rules. Let the market fix everything. Let the market decide. And by the 1830s, 1840s, the market had decided that the slave labor of children was necessary to produce cotton, which could be sold all around the world and produce riches the likes of which had never been seen by anyone. Of course, the working class people of Britain lived much worse lives in 1840 than they did in 1640. Yeah. So the standard of living for most Europeans in that time actually went down. The colonial powers became rich and powerful, but they became rich and powerful as states, right, not as populations. Right. This was before consumerism. It was before the idea of, you know, a prosperous population is a prosperous nation. Right. This was a prosperous elite was a prosperous nation. Oh, right.
Yeah, I'm glad we don't live in that day and age anymore.
Well, look at things like the American Revolution, right? And one of the things that modern Americans are hoodwinked and told that, you know, this was about taxation without representation. This was about us being free from British taxes. The British were barely taxing the Americans, and they were taxing the Americans only for their own defense. And in fact, the people that they were trying to tax were essentially the robber barons of their days, massive slave owners, including most of the founding fathers who owned slave plantations and would have been subject to those taxes. And they saw that as a threat to their own prosperity. So this idea that the Americans fought for freedom from petty tyranny of the British is quite laughable. They fought mainly for the freedom of their upper class to become exceedingly wealthy. One of the main things the American Revolution was fought over was the expansion of the Americas into the Western territories. The British made treaties with the Native Americans, and the people living in the colonies didn't want to honor those treaties. And they didn't want to honor those treaties because they had slaves and they had cash crops. They wanted to grow. And this is the reality. And this is what the labor theory of value essentially created. A period in which sort of anything goes capitalism produced huge amounts of wealth for the tippy top 0.001%. So this is the first big expansion in the colonial and post-colonial period of income inequality. We talked about how at the end of feudalism, feudal lords were using the wealth that they had to invest in colonization. Well, this was the sort of long-term extent of what that meant, because that created a smaller class of, they were called the petits bourgeois, the workers who got a little bit of capital and became industrialists themselves. But the chasm between the very poor and the very rich was growing, and it was growing faster and faster. And up to about the end of the 19th century, this is when the Industrial Revolution is really in full swing, there's a crisis, right? And the crisis comes at a point when essentially employers have reached such heights of wealth that they have developed technologies which produce so much that there's no longer a need.
A need for what?
For the products. So what happens when you've developed your technology to produce food, to produce machines, to produce consumables, so much, and there's become so few people who can afford them that you run out of customers. What do you do? What would you do? And by the way, Marx predicted this. Karl Marx predicted that capitalism would end when there were essentially no customers left for the extremely expensive goods that would be produced. He was wrong because of another innovation, right? And it comes from our very own countryman, my countryman, Henry Ford. And he came up with something, the $5 day. Right,
$5 day.
So imagine the 19 teens and 20s, a factory worker in one of Ford's car plants. Teens, 20s, was making $1 a day. Can you guess what the turnover was per year for one of those jobs?
Like not so many, I assume. They wanted to keep it.
It was $1 a day, which was barely livable. And you were sitting there making widgets every day, the same exact thing for hours on end, over and over.
So
factory system.
They had plenty of time to get other jobs.
Right. So turnover in Ford's factories was up to 400%, meaning for every one job, you had to hire 4 people every year, right? And it got so bad, industrialization essentially got so efficient, and the jobs got so mind-numbing and so small and so boring that no one would want to work them anymore. And not only did no one want to work those jobs, but nobody had money to buy all the things that was being produced. Sure. So Henry Ford figures out, hang on a second, why am I going through 4 people a year in one job and paying them as little as possible, and then they can't buy anything anyway? Why don't I pay one guy 4 times more? As it turned out, 5 times more, and I'll just keep him in that job. So he raised his pay from about $2 a day to 5. So this is like the equivalent today of, let's say we live in the Czech Republic, so let's say you make 300 crowns a day, or 300 crowns an hour, I should say. This is like somebody obviously giving you 1,500 an hour.
Right, okay.
It's a huge difference.
Yeah,
I mean, in your lifestyle, this is tripling, quadrupling, quintupling your income. You know, it's an enormous difference. So all of a sudden you have hundreds of thousands of people making $5 a day. And what happens when Ford starts paying his employees $5 a day? He suddenly has access to all the best employees. The other companies that are competing with him, that are making other products, they also have to start paying their workers more, or else they'll leave. So he has a ton of new customers. All those people who were working at DeWalt or at Dow Chemical or working here, working there, all of a sudden they're all making more. And they're all making more so they can all buy more products. So essentially Ford, having figured out how to extract the maximum amount of value from wage labor, he makes this leap. And he figures out, no, the future of economic growth is not maximizing the productivity of an individual. It is allowing that individual to consume more. If I pay that individual $5 a day, 5 other people will also get paid $5 a day. And every one of those 5 people will buy one of my cars. So I will make more. So this was the uncoupling, the sort of final end to the idea of labor as a theory of value. Suddenly, the person became valuable as a customer, right? And that's how we get into what we have today, which is consumerism. The idea that you contribute to economic growth just by being a part of the economy, right? This is 100 years ago, this was a non-concept, right? And today, this is the concept that we use to understand economic growth. And we're going to talk about, in our next episode, about growth theory, why that's such a broken concept today. But suffice to say, 100 years ago, it solved a very real and very apparent problem, which was that society was producing more goods, but there was nobody left to consume those goods. So we figured out, okay, let everybody consume goods, and everybody is even richer. And let's not worry about the consequences of that to the ecology, to the human soul. There's a really funny thing you can see circulating online, which was a little insert in the New York Times, like a 1-paragraph thing. And it says, did you know, and this is like from 1917, currently industry produces over 9 billion tons of carbon dioxide gas, which is released into the atmosphere. In several centuries, this may amount to something significant.
Jesus Christ.
So to the factory owners of the 1920s, you know, that was a non-issue, and it was a non-issue for many decades to come. But today, we're facing the consequences of the world that created. So it's with that understanding that we'll come to our next topic, where we're gonna, thankfully for you, Kurt, slow down again. And we're not going to talk about history. We're going to talk about growth theory. Okay? So once again, this is 3-day work weeks. Because we only work 3 days a week, we've done 3 episodes. So we'll stop here. These episodes will be broken up again into 8 introductory chapters, let's say. And we'll get back together in another recording session and do another couple of episodes.
Yeah.
So thank you. You can support us on on Patreon, what was our name again? Space Lasagna Productions.
Yeah.
Space Lasagna Productions. Patreon.com/Space Lasagna or Space Lasagna Productions on Facebook. We have a $3 tier. We have a $20 tier. We have a $50 tier. Is very unrealistic, but you can still contribute. 1,000 people